We're going to turn the page to our next topic, which is at base really about workers fighting for their rights, fighting for fair wages, the right to really be able to sustain themselves and their loved ones. And as we continue the conversation, we're very honored to be joined by Teo Reyes, who is the Chief Program Officer at the Restaurant Opportunity Center United, or ROC United. Teo, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much.
No, of course. Really happy to have you, and I think some people have probably seen what I felt was a bombshell article in the New York Times earlier this week. The other NRA, essentially stealing money from workers by giving them these classes in order to then lobby against workers' interests to raise the tip minimum wage. So maybe before we get into the specifics of this story and some of the other NRA, I think there's still some people who don't fully understand the tip minimum wage issue, are actually unaware that there's a huge classification of workers that are paid below the minimum wage. So if you could just give maybe a capsule framing of workers who are heavily affected by these minimum wage issues.
Well, it's the minimum wage in the country is still at the federal level. It's $7.25 an hour, right? And there's close to 20 states that still apply the $7.25 minimum wage, and then a subset of those, I believe 16 or 17 states, have a subminimum wage that's only $2.13 an hour, which means that if you receive tips, if you're in an officially tipped occupation, your employer only pays you $2.13 an hour, and your actual wage is paid by the customer. So it's actually the customer that's employing the services directly of someone's labor, and people don't realize that when they're tipping, you're actually paying that individual's wage. But it varies by state. Some states have higher minimum wage, and we're part of this effort around the country to eliminate the subminimum wage so that all workers get a basic minimum wage, and any tips are a supplement to that basic wage. And the National Restaurant Association has been the primary opponent of raising the subminimum wage and raising the minimum wage, but they will use the subminimum wage as a tool to try to keep wages low overall. In the last time the minimum wage increased was in 92, right? The last time that there was a law passed to increase the subminimum wage, and what the NRA did is they negotiated with the administration, the Clinton administration at the time, to say, okay, we won't oppose the increase to the minimum wage, bringing it up from $4.50 to $7.25, as long as you keep from $4.25 to $7.25, as long as you keep the subminimum wage frozen at $2.13 an hour. So it stayed at $2.13 an hour, and it's never increased since then. And so that's, it's a major problem around the country. At the state level, whenever there's an effort to increase the minimum wage, the National Restaurant Association is one of the primary opponents, and they receive a lot of obeisance, you could say. Basically, a lot of legislatures and city councils bend over backwards to follow through with what the NRA lobbyists want. It's a major problem that we've been dealing with for decades now.
And then, it's amazing to me, too, that this is an NRA, if you will, that I've personally never heard of. And I've actually been a server. I mean, I actually know so many people who have been servers before. So many people at some point in their, before they, when they're in school or when they're in college or even afterwards. I mean, some people have it as a second job. Some people, it's actually their profession. Regardless, I feel like almost everyone I know has at some point in their lives been a server and had to deal with their wages basically coming from customers, although we don't see it in the US like that. So it's just so amazing that this organization, this lobbying group, has so much power and nobody's ever heard of it. But what's even more interesting is, of course, you have these training courses that restaurant workers are supposed to take. And these training courses that they have to pay to take, I don't know if it's them who have to pay for it or who they're working for pays for it, but then that money ends up going into lobbying against raising their wages. Can you talk a bit about that? Because, I mean, that's an even more insidious aspect of this, is that workers are unknowingly funding their own poverty, poverty wages in a way.
It is a pretty insidious system. So essentially, every state requires that at least one individual at any restaurant be certified as a food safety certified in food safety handling. Food handling safety, but there are some states that require everybody in an establishment to have that certification. One of the most popular and well-known certification programs is called ServSafe, and that is owned by the National Restaurant Association. And so it's the default, and so employers, will send their staff to go get that food handling card. Will have public health departments telling workers to go to ServSafe to get that food handling card, and so you have this whole system of incentives where you have both employers and government entities really telling workers, go here, get your food handling card. In some cases, you pay $10, some cases up to $27, $28, and then that's a requirement to go to work, and that money then gets shifted to the lobbying program at the NRA to essentially work against their interests. There's one particular example which is really really highlights this. In Allegheny County, the health department was a member of the state affiliate of the National Restaurant Association. So the health department for the county was sending money to the NRA. I believe they still are. At the same time that Pennsylvania Lodging and Restaurant Association was lobbying the county to prevent any law that would increase sick days for individuals who are sick at work, right? So they're using the money to make sure that no laws pass that would increase protections for both employers and customers and make sure people are healthier, and it's being supplemented, it's being paid through the county health department. So it's a really insidious system. It's tied to the fact that they are seen in many cases as a very benign entity. Most people have very positive feelings towards the restaurants. I do as well. The restaurant I go to, I know the people who work there, I know the owners, and so my immediate feeling is going to be, this is great, right? And legislators that don't know will think, okay, these are people that I know, I respect. I will do fundraisers there. So when they come and talk to me about this, I really listen to them. But then that relationship deepens. They start to receive more and more funding support from the National Restaurant Association. You'll see a greater number of fundraisers held at some key restaurant locations. And then that influence just grows. And it's really an influence at every level of government, at city, like I mentioned, at city council, at the state legislature, and at the federal level as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm glad we got it in there in D.C., but I was there for that initiative, 71, I guess it was, maybe 77. That was unbelievable to see how overwhelmingly the city said, let's do this. And they said, oh, it's just a recommendation. I mean, that's when I learned about the other NRA, and man, they put some muscle in. But, one question I have, Teo, that I think I always wonder this. Why do we tip? I mean, I've been lucky enough to go around the world, and been very, privileged to do so. And there are obviously some countries where, you don't tip because people are paid at least the approximation of a living wage. So I always wonder, how did we even get to this kind of system whereby you would say, here's a job that will demonstrably not pay you enough money to survive?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple of ways to look at that. One is, what's the historical root of tipping, and that is a really problematic history. And the other is, what is the role of the tipping system now, and what do we do about it? And I think that's a lot more complicated. I mean, historically, tipping comes out of emancipation. You have a large pool of free black labor. And employers don't want to pay them wages, and so when they go into the service industry, basically they're paid through tips only, and it's again the customers who are paying these individuals directly. The best known example, of course, is the Pullman porters who were working on trains, who were living off of tips, not really getting a wage, and very famously fought for a union that instituted wages for workers, servers in the railroad, hospitality workers really that were on the railroads. When the Fair Labor Standards Act passed during the Depression, it excluded businesses that were not involved in interstate commerce, and under that definition, that included all service entities as well. So they were not required to pay any minimum wage. Restaurants were not, gas stations were not, really retail establishments were not required to pay any type of minimum wage. Once that was amended in the 60s, that was the first time that there was actually any type of wage at all for tipped workers. And it was set at about 50%, sometimes 60% of the minimum wage. And then it got frozen, as I mentioned, the last time the minimum wage increased. So that's the history of it. So there's an insidious history attached to it. But when you look at it today, it becomes much more complicated because people who work in the industry are very emotionally attached to the tipping system. It's when you get a really big tip, it's like you won the lottery, and it's a really huge incentive, right? And so people are really emotionally attached to it. We don't advocate to eliminate the tipping system. We advocate to make sure that there is a solid wage for those days when people don't get tipped. And then tipping can serve to really help people move into thriving wage jobs, into higher wage jobs, to really be able to raise a family. And you see that around the country. So there's 7 states that don't have a sub-minimum wage, and now District of Columbia and Michigan is poised to eliminate its sub-minimum wage as well. And in those states, which it's certainly it's California, Oregon, Washington, the ones that are known as being more progressive, perhaps, but it also includes Alaska, Montana, Nevada, and Minnesota. In those states, there is no sub-minimum wage. Everyone gets paid a full wage, and people still tip there. It's a custom in this country to tip. And so what that means is that there's lower rates of poverty among servers, among tipped workers in those states. And what's really interesting is that the percentage of workers of color in poverty who are tipped workers is much lower. It's like cut in half or more in those states. So it really helps to increase opportunities, economic opportunities, getting rid of that sub-minimum wage, raising wages for everybody really helps to eliminate some of those disparities we see that are tied to race and gender in this country.
Yeah. I mean, that history lesson you just gave explains a lot. I mean, it really is a very uniquely American thing. The whole having this like poverty wage, and then having this really large amount that people, are supposed to tip in order to make up for the fact that the wages are so low. Because you don't see that abroad. And if you ever go to any European country, for example, and you tip even like 5%, people act like you just like saved their children from like a burning building or something, because it's just like not a common thing to do, because people make a decent wage as servers. And that goes for countries in the global south as well. It's actually not common to be tipping 15 to 20% like it is in the US. I'm sorry, you want to say something? I can see.
No, and I think that's what's really complicated, because we have this system here where tipping seems to play a role in, when you eliminate the sub-minimum wage, it seems to play a role in helping lift people out of poverty into higher wages, because they have that higher base wage, right? They can depend on that now $15 an hour in most of these states, right? But you go abroad, and there's all of a sudden, because you have Americans traveling abroad quite a bit, this growing, like if you go abroad and want to follow local tipping customs, and they know you're American, they might resent you for that, right? Because they know, well, all the Americans tip me a lot, right? But at the same time, you don't want to create a system that encourages them to get paid less either, right? If they have a system that sets a living wage for everybody, that really professionalizes that labor, you don't want to play a role in undermining that. So I think it's really complicated.
Yeah,
it's
Of
difficult.
course.
Well, for me, it's not that complicated, because I feel like if you're serving me my food, I want you to get paid whatever you want to get paid. You're serving me my food, you're flying my plane. Like, look, whatever you need, that's what I want you to have. Because look, you got to take care of home. But I think it raises another, I think, important question about the way a lot of times these debates play out in the legislative arena. And it's maybe not a full appreciation of, the stratification also of the restaurant industry. I mean, I remember, when we had the failed attempt in DC, that was a lot of the discussion is, they were finding people who, great people. I'm not trying to, rip them as people, but, you're a bartender at the Palm. So you're making, a huge amount of money, because this is serving like the richest people on earth. So that's, is what it is. But then if you're at IHOP or Denny's or Waffle House, you're in a very different situation there. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that too, because I think that's something that often gets lost, because there's always this attempt to find sort of the exceptions of people who are doing really well and say, if we change anything, they'll stop doing well.
Well, one thing that they have been very successful at, what the National Restaurant Association has been very successful at, is scaring workers into thinking that if you raise the wage, that everyone's going to stop tipping and you're going to lose a lot of money. And that's just not true. It's just not the case. But they've been really successful at scaring workers. You had a lot of workers in DC who went to city council. I was there for that, right? Who came in and really spoke against raising the wage, because they were told, oh, you're going to lose all your tips. I mean, it's not rational, because no one goes into a restaurant tipping knowing what that individual earns per hour, right? It's just not, there's that relation. Most people don't have that information available. So tipping it's just again, it's a customary practice in this country. And you have the industry actually I was in Orlando several years ago, and they were trying to push people to tip 30%. And I think that was part of their efforts to keep wages low, right? We need people to earn more to come into work, but we don't want to pay them more. So let's push the customer to try to tip more as well, right? But it's a major issue. The industry, will hire these firms to set up these AstroTurf organizations to really put up Facebook groups and try to agitate them against their best interest. And that's a thing that was very successful in Maine. It was very successful in DC, somewhat so in New York. In DC, you basically had a ballot initiative that was, passed several years ago, overturned by the city council, and then recently passed again. And the city council said they're going to abide by the will of the voters, and that's going to be to the long-term best interest. But there's a lot of workers who oppose that even now. But that changed a bit. The pandemic really changed people's opinion about what it means to be a tipped worker, because there's a lot of places where people were working and they were not getting tipped, and they were getting abused by customers. They were getting abused by management. So that really changed people's perspective on that as well. But that's, it is, from what we've seen, because every state that has raised their wage, even where they've raised the subminimum wage, you do not see an impact on employment in the industry. You just don't. Like employment continues to grow in those states. There isn't this relationship. If anything, there's an inverse relationship in which when you raise the minimum wage, more people go out to eat, more people go, spend money at the bar, etc., and actually employment increases. It's not a huge increase, but there's not any decline. Like the industry would like to tell you, oh, if we have to raise wages, it's going to destroy us all. Everyone's going to close. That's just not true. It hasn't happened anywhere. Everywhere the minimum wage has increased, the industry has continued to grow, and employment has continued to grow as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this before we let you go. Where can people find ROC United and the work you do? I know you guys are working with workers, you're working with the community, fair-minded employers, and others.
Yeah. So we're ROCUnited.org. We're on Twitter, ROC United. We have a TikTok page, Instagram. Please come visit. One of the things that we're really trying to build support for is the Restaurant Worker Bill of Rights, which is an effort that would really move us towards thriving wages for workers. That means more than living wage. It means that your needs are met and you can actually thrive on top of that. The way that includes things such as access to childcare, access to healthcare. So we're really looking at this holistically and try to change the industry so that it's lifting up wages and conditions for everybody instead of what it's historically been, which has been a drag on that. So I encourage people to come and support the Restaurant Worker Bill of Rights, but come check us out at ROCUnited.org. Thank you.
Right on. Teo Reyes, Chief Program Officer at the Restaurant Opportunity Center United, ROC United. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. It's been great.
Mm-hmm.